I help a lot of people buy boats, and something a lot of folks don't consider is buying one from Freshwater, the benefits of doing that, and how easy it can actually be to get the boat home back to the ocean. But of course, there are some things to consider when taking a freshwater boat out to the salty sea, and having done it myself, I know those things all too well. This week on Everything You Need to Know, should you buy a freshwater boat? The first and most obvious thing we're going to talk about is also the most important. Salt water is 5 times more corrosive than fresh water. Salt water is like battery acid to some parts of the boat, and it causes us to replace a lot of parts at pretty standard intervals, and those parts are the steel parts. On a sailboat, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the standing rigging, the stuff that holds the mast up. We can't rightly neglect the rigging, because if we do, hundreds of pounds of mast will be coming down in short order. And while that's scary in itself, there's an even bigger problem that people don't often think about. When 1 or 2 stays or shrouds break and the mast comes down, it will of course happen in the worst weather possible, and the mast will likely fall over the side of the boat into the water and land beside the boat, which is already bad news. But then the remaining rigging that's still attaching the boat to the mast will pull the mast back toward the boat, and if it hits the hull perpendicular to the hull, it'll put a very big hole in the boat right at the waterline. Boats have been lost by this way too many times, and it happens in just a few minutes. Often there's not time to react. That's why we carry bolt cutters on cruising boats, to cut the mast free as fast as we can if it should happen to fall down. So the goal is obviously not to let the mast fall down, and that means having good, solid standing rigging in good repair. I've sailed on the Great Lakes most of my life, and that means fresh water, no salt. Our rigging here lasts a very long time before we see any signs of rust or corrosion or fatigue. Many boats up here still have 40-year-old rigging, and it'll pass a survey, a dye test, crevice corrosion inspection, and any other test you want to throw at it. That's just normal up here on the Great Lakes. But on the ocean and salt water, the standing rigging will often show signs of rust or corrosion after just 10 years, maybe 20 if you're really lucky and it's been kept very clean. Some of the top tier insurance companies, the ones you'll have to use if you finance the boat, often demand standing rigging be replaced every 12 years. Some of them every 10 years. And at 10 grand to replace it, it's not a cheap problem to have. The salt simply corrodes the metal so much faster than fresh water that swapping the rigging every 10 or so years is just something you have to live with. What that means for the boat buyer is that if you find a freshwater boat that with rigging that's been done within the last 10 years or so, it likely has little to no wear on it. It simply doesn't corrode anywhere near as fast and can be treated as almost new until you get the boat back to salt water. But it's not just the rigging. The impact of being in fresh water on every part of these boats is drastically better. Sailboats are covered with stainless steel, and all of it wears out eventually, but the freshwater boats are almost always rust-free. And think of all the little fittings on a sailboat, the nuts and bolts, the stainless steel screws, hundreds, if not thousands of them. And of course, the electrical system. Any boat owner knows all too well that when some piece of equipment or some light starts acting weird, the first place to check is the electrical connection of that device, where we all know all too well the green chalky built-up corrosion inside those crimp connectors, or on the spade terminals, the battery terminals, the bus bars. It's a constant battle chasing down that corrosion on electrical connections all over the boat. And in freshwater, the lack of salt in the air means this stuff happens much, much slower on these boats than on the boats in the ocean. In the freshwater air, we might only clean electrical connections and find problems like this after 5 or more years. It just takes forever for stuff like that to build up. It takes so long to happen that our electrical connections up here are usually more of a install it and forget it, because it just lasts that long. While we're talking, I'm actually working on a couple of new videos, and I'm going to try to hire somebody to write some scripts for me for the Lady K videos, probably $50 an hour. So if you or somebody you know would be able to write these scripts on the subjects that I sort of come up with, please get a hold of me. You can actually send me a message at ladyksailing.com/consults if you're interested in setting something up. Now, with all that lack of corrosion, it sounds really good on these freshwater boats, but there is something very big on these boats that you will need to watch for if you're looking at them. Some freshwater boats were designed specifically for freshwater, and they don't use what's called a closed-loop cooling system for the engine. Basically, the engine just sucks up seawater from under the boat, and it pumps it through all the cooling circuits and cavities in the engine so it can cool itself down, and then it spits that seawater out the exhaust. And this is fine if it's fresh water. It can run through the engine without much problem, but if you were to drive that same boat out to the salt water, the salt in the water would build up in the engine's cooling circuits and its cavities, eventually blocking them off completely, causing the engine to overheat. Or the salt water would corrode the heck out of the inside of the engine and ruin it entirely. Saltwater boats, on the other hand, use a different system to avoid that problem. Actually, most freshwater boats use this system too. It's called a closed-loop cooling system with a heat exchanger. Basically, the engine has a closed loop of proper radiator fluid running through it, the green stuff. And it runs through the engine getting nice and hot, and then it runs to a little tank to cool down. And then it runs back to the engine to get hot again. Inside that little tank where we want to cool that radiator fluid down, picture all that hot radiator fluid coming in one end and going out the other and going back to the engine. We have to cool the fluid down, so we run a copper pipe through the middle of the tank. And inside that copper pipe, we run seawater through it, salt water if you're in the salt. The boat basically picks up some salt water from the sea, nice and cold, and it pumps it through that copper pipe where it takes a bunch of the heat from the radiator fluid around it, and then it spits that hot salt water back out into the sea. This way, the salt water never sees the engine. It just comes in, it gets hot as it goes through the tank, and then it goes back to the sea. Now, I said saltwater boats use this closed-loop system, but actually most freshwater boats use it too. You just have to make sure that the boat you're looking at does. Anything with a modern engine will be a closed loop. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make these videos possible. The mission at Lady K Sailing has always been to get more people sailing more easily. If you'd like to help out, please consider becoming a patron. And a big shout out to all the existing patrons that have gotten us this far. I really couldn't do it without you guys. So, buying a freshwater boat might make a lot of sense at this point, but there are some things you need to consider, some changes you'll have to make, and of course, the how to get it home problem. First, the changes to the boat. My boat was a freshwater boat its whole life. It never saw the salty sea, so I did a tremendous amount of research ahead of time and found out it was all actually very simple, much simpler than I had thought, to take a freshwater boat out to the saltwater. And the first and only real main concern is the anode situation. As sailboats do have metal parts protruding into the water, to avoid corrosion on those parts, we bolt a little piece of sacrificial metal onto them, often called a zinc. These are actually called anodes, and what kind of metal you use as the sacrificial metal just has to be softer metal and more susceptible to corrosion than whatever metal you're trying to protect. In my case, it's the propeller and the driveline. In freshwater here on the Great Lakes, we're supposed to use magnesium as sort of our first choice for the sacrificial metal, but aluminum will work too. But in saltwater, magnesium's no good, and you're actually supposed to use real zinc, or also aluminum. So I think you can see where this is going. I checked the anodes that were sold for my drive system, and they came in magnesium, which is what I had on the boat, or aluminum, or zinc. And being as how aluminum was rated as good enough for freshwater and saltwater, I just switched to that. This way I could be protected in the freshwater where the boat was at the beginning of the journey, and then also protected in the brackish or partially salt water along my journey, and then be protected in the salt that I aim to end up in. I might have gone for the additional protection of zinc if I was going to stay in salt water forever. The next step I took on my boat was to install some washdown systems. You'll likely want a washdown sprayer at the anchor, and then one at the back of the boat where you climb in after a swim. This system just uses the boat's fresh water, the drinking water, to spray off all the salt, so that when you bring the anchor and its chain up, it can be put away clean, and that you can get all the salt off your body after you go swimming. It's really miserable to sit there with salt all over yourself after you go snorkeling. One more consideration, salt water is a lot more dense than fresh water. This means that my boat sits about 2 inches higher when it's in the salt water than it did in the fresh water. The density of the water gives my boat more buoyancy and thus less draft from my keel. Fully laden with all my tools, all my belongings, my spare parts, anchor and chain, all the drinking water and all that stuff, my boat needed about 5 foot 5 inches when I was in the fresh water. But it's much closer to just 5 feet when I'm down in the islands, so I can carry more stuff when I'm headed south. While I have you, don't forget to check out my other YouTube channel. The last episode is about the history of the Chicago to Mac sailboat race. I'll leave a link below. So let's say you find the ideal boat. Maybe it's in Chicago or Cleveland somewhere in the fresh water, and it's spent most of its life in that fresh water, so there's not a speck of rust or corrosion on her. How the heck do you get the boat home to the ocean where you want her to be? Do you have to spend 10 grand or something on having her trucked over land? Honestly, this is easier than you might think, and you have some choices, but all of them are sort of worth the adventure in and of themselves. The connections from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic are pretty straightforward. Boats do this stuff every day. The first option is the scenic route, where you won't have to take the mast down, which is nice, and you get to do some locks. And with 2 people on the boat, it's fairly easy, and you get to put the most miles under the keel this way. This is the long way around on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it is truly beautiful, but you'll need to be on the boat for more than a month, maybe 2 months, but it is the best experience that you could possibly have. And you could do the other way, which is about half of the Great Loop. You could go down the Mississippi, but this means motoring for a very, very long time. And if you need to get out into the Gulf, this is kind of the way you want to do it. Or you could do it the fast way, the easiest way, the Erie Canal. You rock up to Buffalo, New York, and they take the mast down for you. You prop the mast up on the deck with some bracing, and you motor the boat from Buffalo to the top of the Hudson through 35 locks. You need some help to do this, somebody to catch the bow lines. And then they'll put the mast back up for you on the Hudson on the other side. And you can do this in about a week if you push hard, 2 weeks if you want to take your time. And while that is the fastest option, the taking the mast down is a pain. And if the mast is too big, more than 60 feet or so, you might opt to actually have it trucked to the other end of the canal and meet you there, instead of fastening it to the deck of the boat. Regardless of which way you choose to get the boat to the ocean, it is all a lot easier than it might seem. And that part of the process will be such an amazing adventure. It's worth doing all by itself. The scenery along the way and the genuine life experience you'll get make it worth doing. And there are a lot of boats here on the Great Lakes for excellent prices with much less wear and tear than their ocean-going counterparts. It really is a sweet deal. If you need help buying a boat and you want to book an hour of my time, head on over to ladyksailling.com/consults. Until next week, guys, keep the heavy side down, but not too far down. We'll see ya.